They wore badges. They shook hands with the victims' families, then went home and cleaned the blood off their own hands. Each murder they investigated led back to them, but no one dared to look that close. They wrote the reports, filed the evidence, and erased their names from the crime scene, until one mistake exposed everything. It began with a cop who knew every detail of the murders he was investigating because he was the one pulling the trigger. Vitor Castanheira, the double-faced officer. He wore his badge like armor, a symbol of trust, a disguise of order. In São Paulo's sprawling police force, Officer Vitor Castanheira was the man everyone wanted on their team. He was disciplined, controlled, efficient to a fault. He didn't drink much. He didn't talk much. He just worked, methodically, endlessly, like the job was all he had. Between 2017 and 2019, his name appeared in dozens of homicide reports. He was there when the city's worst crimes hit the headlines, the shootings, the disappearances, the late-night executions no one could explain. And somehow, Castanheira always seemed to be in the middle of it. Every case he touched ended the same way. A stack of clean paperwork, a neat conclusion, and no suspect to charge. But when the next killing came, he was there again. First on scene, last to leave. At first, no one questioned it. He was the dependable one, the officer who showed up early, who stayed until the evidence was logged and sealed. He cared about the work. He respected the dead. That's what they told themselves. But beneath the surface, something didn't fit. The same shell casings turning up in different crime scenes, ballistics that seemed too consistent for unrelated killings. Witnesses who described a man who moved like a cop, who knew where not to leave footprints, who shot with precision. In the reports, the same details kept reappearing, the same neighborhoods, the same pattern of violence, the same cold efficiency. By late 2018, a prosecutor reviewing multiple homicide files noticed the overlap. At least 4 separate murders, each investigated by the same officer, each crime committed during his off-duty hours. Coincidence? Or something darker? Internal Affairs started to dig, quietly, carefully. They cross-checked radio logs, duty rosters, ballistic reports, anything that could explain why one man's name appeared so often where it shouldn't. And that's when the mask began to slip. His shift records didn't align with the crime scene timelines. His written statements contained descriptions of evidence that hadn't been documented yet. And in at least one case, a photo taken from his personal phone showed the body before forensic teams had arrived. The realization came slowly. Not a single revelation, but a pattern forming in plain sight. The man investigating the murders might also be the one committing them. When word spread through the department, disbelief came first, then fear. Because if Castanheira was guilty, it meant every report he'd filed, every confession he'd written, every piece of evidence he'd handled was compromised. And for a police department, that kind of truth is poison. But the forensics didn't care about politics. In 2020, investigators finally ran a ballistic cross-check using national databases. Casings from 3 separate homicides matched a personal firearm registered to Officer Vitor Castanheira, the same weapon he carried off duty. That discovery shattered the illusion completely. The killer hadn't been hiding from the police. He was the police. When they confronted him, Castanheira barely reacted. He didn't run. He didn't confess. He just stared, silent, expressionless, as if the life they were describing belonged to someone else entirely. Colleagues who'd worked beside him for years later said the same thing. He looked relieved, as if being caught had finally ended something he couldn't stop himself from doing. The investigation revealed no accomplices, no motive that made sense. Some called him a psychopath, others said he'd snapped under the pressure. But the truth was simpler and darker. Vitor Castanheira had lived a double life so seamless, even he might have believed both versions were real. By the time the final report was written, he was no longer an officer, just another name in the city's homicide archives. His own handwriting appeared on evidence reports that now described his crimes. He'd investigated his own murders, reviewed his own case files, and walked free for years inside the very system that should have stopped him. The badge that once protected him had become his disguise, the trust of his peers, his weapon. He wasn't chasing killers, he was chasing the illusion of control, and every victim was proof that he still had it. But justice doesn't stop at one man, and Castanheira's fall wasn't an isolated betrayal. It was a reflection of something larger, something built into the uniform itself. Because years before his story reached Brazil, another officer thousands of miles away had already written the same script. He too wore the badge. He too hunted in the dark. But unlike Castanheira, he didn't just investigate his crimes. He patrolled them. Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer. Before the world knew his name, Joseph James DeAngelo was just another man in uniform, a police officer patrolling quiet California neighborhoods, the kind of man people waved to as they locked their doors at night. But while the city slept, he was already inside. Between 1974 and 1986, DeAngelo lived two lives. One was structured, disciplined, routine. The other, pure terror. By day, he followed rules. By night, he rewrote them. He began small, testing boundaries, break-ins, stolen items, unlocked windows left just slightly ajar. It wasn't about theft. It was about control, the feeling of being unseen inside someone else's life. Soon, the crimes escalated. A string of rapes across Sacramento, then murders stretching through Central and Southern California. Different cities, same precision. The victims never stood a chance. He planned every attack with military focus, cutting phone lines, studying routines, waiting in silence for the moment they felt safe. He knew when police would respond, how long it would take, and which backroads would keep him invisible. Because he was one of them. For years, the man later called the East Area Rapist, and eventually the Golden State Killer, lived behind the shield of law enforcement. He understood the psychology of fear because he created it for a living. He wore the same uniform that his victims trusted. When the first sketch circulated, it could have been anyone, young, white, fit, clean-cut, a face that disappeared in every crowd. But inside the station, DeAngelo would have seen it. He would have read the reports, heard the theories, listened to officers describe his own crimes, and he would have smiled. Each new investigation made him stronger. Every police meeting, every discussion about the unknown suspect was a lesson in how to stay hidden. He didn't just commit his crimes, he studied the investigation around them. He evolved in real time, adapting to every mistake the police made, because he was there to watch them make it. As the years passed, the crimes grew darker, the attacks more violent, his rage more personal. When police closed in on one area, he moved to another. When patrols doubled, he changed his methods. He was a ghost, disciplined, silent, deliberate. And then, suddenly, he was gone. The killings stopped in 1986. No one knew why. The headlines faded, the files collected dust, and California's most prolific serial predator vanished into retirement. For more than 3 decades, his name became folklore, a faceless shadow from the past that haunted old detectives and new recruits alike. Until 2018, a cold case team decided to try something new. They uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA to an open genealogy database, hoping it might match a distant relative. It did. Piece by piece, the family tree narrowed, branch by branch, until only one name remained: Joseph James DeAngelo, a retired police officer, living quietly in a Sacramento suburb, married, 3 daughters, a man who mowed his lawn every weekend and waved to his neighbors. When detectives moved in, they found what they always feared they would: a man who had lived among them, a predator who had listened to police scanners while eating dinner, a killer who knew exactly how far the law could reach and how to step just beyond it. His arrest ended one of America's longest manhunts, decades of questions answered in a single DNA sequence. In 2020, DeAngelo pled guilty to 13 murders and countless assaults. In court, he whispered 2 words before sentencing: "Sorry, sorry." They were quiet, almost meaningless. The same voice that had once ordered people to obey, now barely audible through age and regret. For years, he'd lived as a man of law, and for years, he'd used that law as a mask. He enforced order by day and destroyed it by night. The same badge that had once made people feel safe had protected a man who built his legacy on fear. But D'Angelo wasn't the only one drawn to the line between obsession and investigation. Thousands of miles away, another man lived with the same hunger. But his obsession didn't hide behind a uniform. It hid behind curiosity. He didn't patrol the streets. He studied them, and while others searched for killers, he was quietly building a collection of his own. Manfred Seele, the forensic collector. To anyone passing by, his house looked ordinary. A narrow home in Hofheim, just outside Frankfurt. A quiet street, trimmed hedges, an old car in the driveway. Inside lived a man few people really noticed. Manfred Seele, born in 1946, husband, father. And in his own way, an investigator. At least, that's what he wanted people to believe. He collected stories about murder, taped newspaper articles to the walls of his basement, kept boxes of files labeled with dates, names, and locations. He said it was fascination, curiosity about the human mind. No one questioned it. Every city has people like that, true crime readers, amateur sleuths, the ones who never look dangerous until it's too late. When Seele died in 2014, his death was uneventful. Health problems, natural causes. No one asked for an autopsy. His daughter inherited the house. And for 2 years, it sat quiet until she started cleaning. That's when she found the first container, a heavy, sealed drum in the garage, covered in dust, with a smell that didn't belong. Inside were human remains. The discovery pulled detectives back to the property, and what they uncovered inside changed everything they thought they knew about the man who'd lived there. Seele hadn't just collected newspaper clippings, he'd built a personal archive of horror, hidden compartments behind walls, folders filled with crime scene photos, police sketches, and evidence markers that had never been released to the public. Each clipping came with handwritten notes, measurements, timestamps, victim descriptions, details that only someone who'd been there could know. He wasn't studying crimes, he was reliving them. Over time, investigators began linking his notes to real victims, women who had vanished between 1992 and 2007. Their bodies mutilated, their remains found in rivers, in woods, sometimes never recovered at all. The police had written them off as isolated cases. Different years, different circumstances, no clear suspect, until the DNA spoke. In 2016, samples from one of the containers matched a missing woman named Gisela S. The connection opened a door that couldn't be closed. From there, case after case began to fall into place, each one echoing Seele's handwriting, his patterns, his rituals. He had studied the same crimes he committed, and he had documented them better than the police ever did. Detectives called him Der Sammler, the collector, a man who treated death like a project, someone who didn't kill for anger or impulse, but to complete something, something only he understood. When investigators searched further, they found something even stranger. Among the stacks of documents were internal police reports, not copies from newspapers, but genuine files, confidential information about active murder investigations. That discovery changed the question. Had Seele somehow infiltrated the system? Had someone inside been feeding him details? Or had he simply studied every broadcast, every press release, piecing together a complete picture from fragments no one else cared to connect? No one ever found the answer, and Seele couldn't give one. He was already gone. By the time police finished their review, they'd tied him to at least 5 murders, all women, all killed with precision, all showing signs of ritualistic mutilation. Neighbors who once described him as polite and withdrawn couldn't reconcile the man they knew with the monster in the reports. They remembered him walking his dog every evening, picking up the newspaper each morning, probably the same paper that carried his own headlines. Inside his house, police found a mirror facing his workbench, a single bulb above it, a place where he could study himself. where the investigator and the killer became one reflection. What made Seal terrifying wasn't just what he did. It was how close he was to understanding himself. He wanted to see what police saw. He wanted to know how they thought. And in doing so, he learned how to hide from them completely. When the case closed, the reports described him as a man driven by morbid obsession. But it wasn't curiosity, it was control. The same control that defines every investigator. The need to know, to categorize, to understand. Except Seal's version of understanding required blood. He didn't just collect evidence, he created it. He didn't just read case files, he became one. The archive still exists, sealed in evidence boxes, marked with his name, the pages yellowing with time. Each photo, each note, each trophy. Proof that the man who studied killers had been writing his own study all along. And when his story ended, the question remained. How many others like him are still out there, curious, methodical, invisible, learning from the crimes they haven't yet committed? Because for every killer who hides behind obsession, there's another who hides behind authority. A badge, a title, a promise of justice that becomes its disguise. And in 2012, in the Indian state of Punjab, one of those promises was broken by a man sworn to keep it. Sukhwinder Singh, the killer cop. In 2012, the Punjab police were investigating a small-town murder, a case that should have been simple. A man shot dead in Tarn Taran district, a suspect already identified. An officer assigned to lead the inquiry, Sub-Inspector Sukhwinder Singh. He was a veteran of the force, strict, efficient, the kind of cop who followed every rule, at least on paper. His record was clean, his superiors respected him, and the men under his command obeyed without question. But what no one knew, not yet, was that the man investigating the murder was the one who'd pulled the trigger. It started with an argument. A suspect defied questioning. A confrontation that should have ended in an arrest. Instead, Singh reached for his gun. One shot, one body on the ground. When it was over, the silence was heavier than the sound that caused it. Singh didn't panic. He didn't report it as a mistake. He turned the killing into a case. He became both the detective and the murderer, writing the narrative before anyone else could. The gunfire became self-defense. The dead man became armed. And the official report told a story that no one dared to question. For weeks the lie held. The paperwork was perfect. The evidence matched his account, because he was the one who created it. He filed every document himself, handpicked the witnesses, and guided the investigation toward its conclusion. By the time the file reached headquarters, Singh had already solved his own crime. But truth has a way of surviving lies, especially in forensics. The autopsy didn't fit his report. The entry wound was wrong, the powder residue too close, the ballistics too precise, and the trajectory suggested a distance far shorter than Singh had claimed. A small inconsistency, enough for internal investigators to reopen the file. They re-examined the weapon, matched the bullet to his service revolver, and found traces of the victim's blood in Singh's patrol vehicle. The illusion fell apart piece by piece until there was nowhere left to hide. When confronted, Singh denied everything. He said the evidence was planted, the reports forged, but every test, every trace, every line of data whispered the same thing. He was the killer he'd been assigned to catch. In July 2012, Sukhwinder Singh was arrested. His badge was removed, his weapon confiscated. The same hands that had once written official reports were now signing his confession. The department tried to contain the scandal, but the damage was done, because Singh's betrayal wasn't just a crime. It was a fracture in trust, a reminder that even the ones enforcing justice can twist it to erase their own guilt. When his trial began, his colleagues refused to testify. Some claimed fear, others claimed loyalty. But the truth was simpler. No one wanted to admit that one of their own had turned the system against itself. In the end, the verdict was clear. He was sentenced for murder and evidence tampering. A cop investigating his own crime. The perfect symmetry of corruption. And yet his story wasn't unique, because the pattern never ends with one man. From Brazil to Germany, from the US to India, the same faces keep reappearing. Officers who blur the line between justice and violence until they can no longer tell which side they're on. And in Chicago, that line had already been crossed decades earlier, not by one officer but by a commander, a man who built his entire career on torture, silence, and fear. John Burge, the commander of torture. Chicago, 1972, a city divided by crime, poverty, and power. On the south side, trust in the police was already thin, and John Burge was about to burn through what little was left. He joined the force after serving in Vietnam. Decorated, charismatic, a man who carried himself like a soldier long after the war had ended. He rose through the ranks fast, respected by his superiors, feared by everyone else. By the late 70s, Burge commanded his own unit, an elite team tasked with cleaning up the city's rising violence. Their job was to make arrests, their method was to make people talk, and Burge had brought something home from the battlefield to help him do it. Victims later described the same routine: black sites on the south side, interrogations that lasted for hours, suspects chained to radiators, hoods over their heads. But the real horror began when the electricity came out. Burge and his men used hand-cranked generators, field devices from Vietnam, wired to the ears, lips, or genitals of the people they questioned. Each shock followed by the same words: "Tell the truth." More than 100 men, almost all of them black, accused Burge's unit of torture. The details were always the same: plastic bags, beatings, mock executions. And when the screaming stopped, the confessions appeared, neatly typed and signed. For years, no one believed them. In court, their claims were dismissed as lies from criminals trying to escape punishment. Judges looked at the paperwork, saw Burge's signature, and assumed justice had been done. Because on paper, John Burge was a hero. He closed cases, he got results, he made headlines. The city needed numbers, and Burge gave them numbers. Behind closed doors, he reviewed every report his men filed, the same reports that covered up their own crimes. He investigated the very torture complaints directed at his unit, signed off on their innocence, and filed the evidence away under unsubstantiated. For 2 decades, he lived in that contradiction, the man who policed the violence he created. But secrets that long and that cruel don't stay buried. In the early 1990s, patterns began to emerge. Different cases, same injuries, same names, same unit. A journalist noticed, then a lawyer, then a city council that could no longer ignore the weight of the stories piling up. Survivors described rooms filled with the smell of burnt wires and sweat, a man's voice counting between shocks, a name shouted before the lights went out. The evidence was overwhelming, but the system Burge built was even stronger. Most of the files were gone, witnesses scattered, and too many careers depended on his silence. So the truth took decades to surface. In 2010, John Burge finally faced court, not for torture itself, but for lying about it under oath. The crimes he committed were too old to prosecute, the system he corrupted too tangled to untie. He was convicted of perjury and obstruction of justice, 4.5 years in prison for 20 years of electric shocks, beatings, and broken lives. When he walked free in 2014, he still collected his pension, while the city he'd terrorized paid millions in reparations to the men he'd tortured. John Burge died in 2018. No confession, no apology, just silence. But the echo of his work remains. In every coerced confession, every overturned conviction, every man who spent decades in prison because the law refused to believe his pain. Burge's name is more than a headline. It's a reminder of what happens when the power to investigate becomes the power to destroy. Because some killers use guns, others use knives, and the rarest kind use the system itself.